The mission was a difficult one in terms of what we heard and the details of the most shocking brutality of the attacks by Hamas and other armed groups that we received. We saw a catalogue of the most extreme and inhumane forms of torture and other horrors. But the mission
That's the voice of the UN Secretary General's Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Pramila Patten. And she was speaking at a news conference in New York a few days ago when she released her report about her fact-finding mission into widespread sexual violence carried out against Israeli women and girls on October 7th. Now, to be clear, it wasn't designed to be a comprehensive police investigation. That's being done by other groups, including some in Israel. But for 2 weeks in February, the UN's team of 9 experts on sexual violence in war went to the country to collect and document evidence to evaluate the allegations that Hamas used sexual violence. The team screened thousands of photos from the scenes. They visited the sites of the Nova Music Festival, of Kibbutz Be'eri, Highway 232, and the military base at Nachal Oz. They watched dozens of hours of videos. They interviewed 34 people, including released hostages, eyewitnesses, and first responders. And they came to the conclusion there is strong evidence Israeli women were not only raped and gang raped on October 7th before they were killed, but in some cases while they were being killed.
Another finding, we also found that there are reasonable grounds to believe that conflict-related sexual violence, including rape and gang rape, occurred during the 7th of October attacks in at least 3 locations, namely the Nova Music Festival site and its surroundings, Road 232 and Kibbutz Reim. And in most of these incidents, victims were first subjected to rape and then killed, and at least 2 incidents relate to the rape of women's corpses.
They said some women had been tied to trees or poles and were found dead, naked, from the waist down. It was a pattern they saw a lot, especially around the music festival area. There were signs of mutilation of genitals, too. The UN also found clear and convincing information that some of the women taken hostage were raped and tortured.
We found clear and convincing information that sexual violence, including rape, sexualized torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, has been committed against captives. And we also have reasonable grounds to believe that such violence may still be ongoing against those still held in captivity.
After 150 days. Now, a lot of what's in this report is information Israel's been saying for months, including one case they debunked about a pregnant woman being killed and her baby cut out of her womb. But the very fact that the UN's own report now confirms sexual violence against Israeli women is being seen as an important victory in Israel's fight for justice.
No sensible organization, entity, or individual can keep on saying it didn't happen. After this report, it will no longer be possible to deny.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Thursday, March the 7th, 2024. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, sponsored by Metropia. The UN Special Report was issued just ahead of International Women's Day, which is tomorrow, Friday, March 8th. And the timing couldn't have been more welcome, especially for Professor Rachel Halpern-Kadari. She's an Israeli law professor from Bar-Ilan University. And when the UN asked if it could carry out this study, she's the one who convinced the Israeli government to cooperate, because the government's got deep suspicions and distrust of anything to do with the UN, not the least of which because it took the UN and its Women's Rights Office 8 whole weeks to say a word about the widespread sexual violence. Professor Halpern-Kadari is a world-recognized expert in women's rights, and she's been in Canada all week, meeting politicians, diplomats, Jewish community leaders, and academics to raise awareness. Now, some critics, including Israeli politicians, felt the report didn't go far enough because it doesn't directly condemn Hamas for the crimes, and because there is a small part of it that suggests Israeli prison guards may have abused Palestinian inmates in the West Bank, although not going as far as rape. Professor Halpern-Kadari thinks the 23-page report punches above its weight, and she joins me now.
Thank you for having me on the show.
How did you convince them and your colleague, Pramila Patten, to actually do this investigation? Because it's separate from the other ones that are going on, the Israeli law enforcement people. How did this come about?
So it was actually the challenge was to convince the Israeli authorities to open the door and to send an official invitation for a UN entity. Ms. Patton herself, from the beginning, was keen on visiting Israel, and she was the first one to issue a very strong statement, not just unequivocally condemning Hamas, but also expressing grave concern regarding the reports of the ongoing sexual violence in captivity based on what the hostages that returned had reported on. Israeli authorities, perhaps somewhat justifiably, hold some skepticism and distrust against UN in general. So it was important to make the point that we should distinguish between different UN agencies. Special representative is not the same as UN Women and is not the same as Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. Each and every one is a different entity, and the Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict has a very focused and relatively narrow mandate, only sexual violence in conflict, not other war crimes or alleged war crimes. And this what makes her extremely pertinent and relevant to visit and to come up with findings. The fact that I had known her, I worked with her for many years.
10 years, yeah.
Yes, and I was always very appreciative of her expertise and professionalism and integrity. So this was also important in convincing the government that we should invite her and cooperate with her, and all the government people were very, very cooperative, including the police, the IDF, the Shin Bet. Was very important. Shows that there are opportunities where the UN does do its job, and it is worthwhile to give the credit for that.
Yes, we all know the UN Women took many, many weeks and months to say anything. There's other reporters that are doing their work which are less credible. So what is the weight or the legal standing even? What is the importance of her report? Where does it go? How does it help? When the other ones maybe have higher profile even?
It could be that the other ones have higher profile in the media, and it also very much depends on which media outlets we are looking at. But in terms of standing within the international world community, and also with respect to international law, and most importantly, with respect to the record, to setting the record straight, to setting the historical record straight, this is the most authoritative organ that specializes in sexual violence in conflict. So if UNRWA says something, it is obviously not as credible and will not be regarded as authoritative and as credible as this report. Now, the findings of this report will also be integrated into the annual report of the Secretary General in the part on sexual violence and conflict. And I hope that it will lead to include Hamas in the blacklist of entities that commit, that condone, or that permit the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. I also think that this can and should serve for other countries to side with Israel and to finally, eventually get to the point that should have happened a long time ago, that Hamas is regarded as a terrorist organization by the UN, by other countries. And just like the world was united in building a coalition against ISIS, this is what should happen with respect to Hamas, a coalition against Hamas and against its allies, including the Islamic regime of Iran, including Russia, including China. We know that we know that Iran trained Hamas fighters. We know that they were there before the attack. We know that they're helping them now with a campaign of denial.
So let's talk about that. You said that it's going to help with the historical record. It might have a ripple effect. But what about criminal charges or sanctions or International Court of Justice? How does this, if at all, document get used and their research? Where does it go from here, besides what you said, which is the Secretary General's annual report?
I think that it can also help in the proceedings that are already underway in the ICC, the International Court of Justice. As far as I know, the International Court of Justice is already conducting an investigation. There had been complaints filed with the ICC by hostages' families, by victims' families.
Yes, and the Canadian group, the Raoul Wallenberg Association, was the key who put that together at The Hague. We reported on it.
Exactly. So this could be very important for them to, when they contemplate the possibility of issuing international arrest warrants.
Okay, let's talk about some of the contents. The report, as you must have read, 23 pages, did state clearly that it was very difficult for their investigators to speak to, interview victims. We're very reluctant. What do you know about their reluctance to speak to these investigators?
No, so it's not reluctance. It's the fact that witnesses are also survivors of the massacre, and they are also extremely traumatized. They also have a lot to overcome. And the team, the fact-finding missions team, did speak to first-hand eyewitnesses, however, not to survivors. Now, as we know, most of the survivors had been killed immediately after they were assaulted as part of Hamas' plan to eliminate any evidence and to silence the victims forever. And those that survived were mostly taken hostage to Gaza. The few survivors that are in Israel are unable to speak. It's not reluctance. It's true inability. They're not in a state to talk to anybody except to their therapists. And I spoke to 2 therapists who are treating survivors. So I know that there are handful. Pramila Patton, with her so many years of experience, is the first one to know. And she also explained that. She explains that in the press conference that she gave after the release of the report, that it takes years. She keeps repeating the example of a Bosnian woman who stepped forward 24 years after the fact. So we really don't know if they are ever able to speak.
The language that she used, there were 3 different terms, and as a lawyer, it would help our audience to understand some of these significance of the wording. She said, in certain cases, there were clear and convincing information that the hostages were raped and tortured, and then reasonable grounds that it was ongoing. And whereas other things, she said things like credible circumstantial information. So can you explain just briefly, in legal terms, the different levels and whether it matters?
Yes, it matters. It goes from the strongest evidentiary weight to the weakest. When they say clear and absolute information, that means that they had been shown evidence which is irrefutable. And I cannot go into details about the sources of that information, but it is irrefutable.
I know you can't say maybe or don't want to say specifics, but in her report, they talked about the video hours that they were watching, the images. Is that where you're getting the information, or also from witnesses? Like, just credible? Is it from actual?
It's more than the video.
Okay, keep going. So then, clear and irrefutable.
The second category is the category that relies on videos and photographs, which, I mean, if it were a criminal court, then a defense lawyer might cast doubts as to the origin of the video, like we don't know who exactly took it and when and what equipment.
Was it edited? Yeah.
Oh, or is it edited? Yeah. So that is why this is of somewhat lesser degree, but it means that they were convinced of the credibility, and that, by the way, it's also important to note, and they say it in the methodological part of the report, that for each piece of evidence, they sought for two sources. If they only had one source, they did not include it. And the third, the circumstantial evidence, is they actually give an example of what can be concluded from other evidence, so that if there is a repeated pattern of photographs of bodies of women, and if it also described repeatedly the same manner by first responders that they interviewed, it is reasonable to conclude what that specific position of the bodies, of the legs, of nakedness, of blood, etc., what it is indicative of. But this is a deduction. This is a conjecture. That is why they refer to circumstantial evidence.
And in some parts of the report, they did say, for example, Kibbutz Be'eri, that they didn't find specific examples. They couldn't prove that there was sexual violence. They think about it. They also couldn't prove one of the most famous outrages that came out. And no, you're shaking your head. Go ahead.
I'm shaking my hand because I think I know what you refer to, and it should not have been spread. It should not have been given such visibility when people talked about it. It was actually debunked quite early on, and this just points to the danger in spreading misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, I'm just, for our listeners, it's horrible. So if you don't want to listen now, skip ahead. About a pregnant woman whose fetus was taken out. She was killed and the fetus was murdered. They couldn't prove this, and they put that in very clearly. So, but you mentioned earlier, Hamas had denied all this. And in Canada, there were several politicians and rape crisis centers who actually signed a document, I'm sure you're aware, saying they didn't believe that this happened. It was a big story. I'm wondering now how this counters Hamas's campaign of denials.
I think this is the most significant place where this report comes in. It is a report of the highest authoritative position within the UN, which is the highest international body accepted by all nations of the world. And when it says this is what happened, of course, Hamas continues to deny, but sensible people, stakeholders, countries, states, organizations that may have until now had some doubts or did not want to just take whatever Israel says for it, they will now have no choice but to read this. And I truly appreciate the fact that they decided to publish it with the explanation of the methodology that shows how careful they were. And just like you said before, they also say what they weren't able to prove or what they found incorrect. So by that, it is very, very convincing.
In the report, they, aside from investigating what happened to the Israeli women in Israel, they also went to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. And there are reports in this document of people telling that the prisoners who were detained in the West Bank suffered sexual threats, abuse, being naked, taking off their hijabs, things like that, but no rapes. But certainly cause for investigation further. Is this surprising to you? How did you take this?
It's not surprising, and it was expected. But what we should note is that in the report, they only recount what they had been told, and they emphasize that they did not look into that. They did not verify it.
Well, no, actually, they did talk to 2 detainees or 3 or 4 detainees
but
who were then released.
without verifying it. They just say, yes, they told us so and so, but they did not attempt to verify or to corroborate it. It's not their responsibility. There are other entities on the ground in the PA whose task is to look into that, so that it cannot be equated to their findings on the part of the sexual violence against Israel that committed by Hamas. Any inappropriate behavior by IDF soldiers or prisoner staff should be looked at and should be investigated, and responsible for that should be put to trial and accountable. But it's not possible to equate the two.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, sponsored by Metropia. Integrity, community, quality, and customer care. You should read the report. I've put the links for you in our show notes. And the author of the report did ask Hamas to immediately and unconditionally release the hostages and stop the sexual violence. And she also called for a ceasefire. You can write to me at ebessner@thecjn.ca, as always, with your comments. Thanks for listening to the CJN Daily.